the next thing we know is Trump is entering the war and has basically demanded an unconditional surrender by the Iranian government.
Uganda, so to speak, eats on both sides.
Donald Trump was leaving to enter peace talks, and his immediate response on Truth Social is, what does he know that I'm going to go and do?
Or no political establishment in the world that has mastered the art of long-term strategic planning and long-term strategic vision. The Communist Party of China is the master at those things. Hello, folks. Welcome to this week's edition of The Bad Natives. My name is Robert Kabushenga, the Bad Native from Kampala. Before we even start, remember one thing: to subscribe, to like, to follow, because that's the only way we will be able to come back and give you what we give you every week, which is the best perspective on Africa that anyone can ever give you. And shout out to Moyo Alabi, who is the fan of the week. And Moyo says, I would like to learn how to write. And the group that's on the Bad Natives is where I want to learn from. Listen, Moyo, you have two of the best writers in Africa's media right here: Charles Onyango Obo and Firio Hafaji. So reach out to them. They'll tell you how to become better than them. But over to you, Firio.
Hello, everybody. I'm Feril Hafaji in Johannesburg. Do like, subscribe, and share. And Moyo, I'd be very happy to chat to you. Thanks for the kind words, Robert.
I'm Charles Onyango Obo, the Bad Native in Nairobi. The city in the sun is not really the city in the sun today. It's a bit
Yeah.
nippy. I think that is the word.
So, I'm still recovering from my 90-kilometer escapade. And so there are muscles I am discovering still exist because they're paining. And they're asking me some questions. But let's start with you, Charles. How have you been? How's Nairobi?
The kids are in a revolutionary mood.
Oh, what are
They
they
were on
doing
the
now?
streets again. Yeah. So
Oh, man.
it's
You know,
it's becoming very routine now.
and it's a powerful reminder of what we're failing, how we're failing them, as a generation ahead of them. And I think that it could go in a direction that's completely sideways.
Absolutely.
Firio, how's Joburg? Is it still cold?
So Bob, Joburg is very cold but very beautiful in summer because the days are crisp and they're blue. And if you're in the sun, then it can get quite warm. So we really do have great winter temperatures. I suppose where I'm at is, I visited Iran along with Ethiopia. It was one of those countries that had really called me to come and see for myself because if you read a mostly Western narrative, I didn't feel like I was getting the full picture. So
Yeah.
many years ago, my niece and I got a visa. It's incredibly difficult to get a visa to go there. You need to have an AIDS test, you need to have lung x rays. So difficult
What?
to get there. But once you are there, yeah, it was the toughest
Why would
visa
you
I'd
need
ever
lung
tried to
X-rays?
get. I guess it was a TB. They were trying to sift for TB risk. I'm not sure, but if you want to go, you just take the steps to get there. And what I found was a country that was quite counterfactual to narrative. So women very much a part of public life. Its history, of course, was Persepolis as a key node of a civilization at that time. Absolutely fascinating. Tehran, which as we speak is being bombed to smithereens, a beautiful capital on the edge of a mountain, women very, very clear part of public life, driving on the streets, etc. So I really loved it. We went to Isfahan, we went to Shiraz, we saw many different parts of the country. So it makes me very sad to witness what's happening there, and so Iran is top of my mind even as I sit in Joburg today.
Which is a good way to get into our conversation and to just let our guys know that today we want to examine three big stories that could affect Africa's future in interesting directions. First, there's a real possibility that the UN could go bankrupt and therefore be forced out of Africa. And then we've got China, which is given countries that it has diplomatic relations with zero tariffs on trade. And that could quite easily shift the trade relations in the world. But before we go to the big story of the week, Adesua, I refuse to accept that Nigeria is behind because my resident tailor lives in Lagos. I have to place orders for my finest clothes from him. And I've just placed an order in preparation for a very, very a very,
I
very
said
powerful.
behind in so many ways, where ahead when it comes to fashion and music and all those things. I can't lie.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing we have
All
is
the
style.
vital things of life, Adesua.
Exactly.
You've been gifting us for such a long time. Chinua Achebe, Fela Kuti. Uh, okay, you threw in an
Thames.
abacha. They threw in an abacha along the way.
Fair enough. I mean, Abacha is no Mobutu, so even though we gave you Abacha, it's not like we gave you such a legend.
Well. You gave us bigger names, Obafemi Awolowo and those kinds of people. So we're grateful for that. We still have Wole, so that's okay. We'll let you off the hook on that. But the big story is a war that's escalating between Israel and Iran, where Israel launched an attack on Tehran, supposedly on Iran, supposedly to destroy their nuclear arms. And then Tehran responded in a more effective way than we could have ever imagined. In fact, at one point, they said they'd hit the intelligence coordinating head office of Israel. And the next thing we know is Trump is entering the war and has basically demanded an unconditional surrender by the Iranian government. And he says they know where the Iranian spiritual leader lives, but for now they won't hit him. Furio, I want to start with you.
Mm.
Every time there's been these kinds of escalations internationally, South Africa has taken the lead. And I want to cite two situations. The first was in 2003 when the US decided to attack Iraq. It is Mandela who spoke out against the wisdom or the lack of it of doing that. And as we know, later on, he turned out to be absolutely on the money, correct. In fact, I think he even made a profit if we're to look at it in financial terms. And the second one is the position that South Africa took when Israel tried to destroy Gaza. So South Africa seems to take a very progressive and enlightened view when it comes to what's happening in the international arena. So what is it looking like from your point of view? How should Africans be looking at this conflict?
I'm sure we'll get to how our continent positions itself with regard to both Iran and the US and Israel. But South Africa, again, has normal relationships with Iran. Just last month, there was a huge expo where many South African businesses went to Iran to be part of that expo. And as we were planning for today, Zain Dango, who is the Director General, that is the lead bureaucrat of the International Relations Department, he's just put out an op ed saying that Israel's idea of preemptive self defense has no standing in international law. There is no such thing. So I guess it's quite clear to me where South Africa is going to place itself when the United Nations hears and begins its hearings on the de-escalation of what's quickly becoming another war. It's clear to me where we're going to be placed. Obviously, our relationship with Iran has come up several times in the course of the ICJ case in that South Africa fronted to warn about a rising genocide. That many times, IPAC is the American Israel Political Action Committee, the most powerful lobby in the US. They put out numerous documents, very flimsy documents, I'd say, showing that South Africa's case had been funded by Iran. Absolutely untrue, but that disinformation really caught a light in a fire. And if you ask ordinary people, they'll mimic that to you until you show them that, in fact, the money came from our own fiscus. So once again, Bob, you're right. South Africa's position on this war is going to clarify very quickly and in a similar direction to the two other instances you've set out for us.
Adesua, you sent us something from Spectator Index, breaking news. What are you picking up about where America is standing on this issue?
I think one of the most significant things we see here is has been Trump's messages on Truth Social. And what we also see in America is a schism form between Trump and his MAGA America First core supporters, right? Because a lot of the Trump core supporters do not want America in another war.
Mhm.
And so we are seeing a sort of break, his support, because usually Israel has just full 100% support in America. Over the last couple of years, particularly because of what has happened in Gaza, and also particularly because of how Netanyahu treated Obama, Israel has lost support on the left, but now also on the right, where usually you have Christian fundamentalists who are just pro-Israel, hardline pro-Israel supporters. You're seeing both people on the left and on the right in America lose support from those groups of people. And so Trump is seeing that pressure, but he's basically ignoring it. But we're seeing problems form in the Trump base and in the Trump camp. There's a new interview with Tucker Carlson and the senator, I believe it's Ted Scott, and he was really hammering on. He said, "You don't know anything about Iran. You don't know the ethnic makeup. You don't know how many people are there, but you want regime change." Um, for me, what is frightening, with the breaking news alerts I sent and with Trump's tweets about the supreme leader, is that we are seeing words and posturing that if it came from any other country in the world, we will all be in shock. We will all be aghast. There is no country in this world, I do not believe, unless it's North Korea, that would tweet about possibly assassinating the leader of another on Twitter or on Truth Social in a very light-hearted manner, in a very threatening manner, as if it's like as if this is not 2025. Like, it's that would be taken as a declaration of war by any country. Right, and we can see it from Museveni's son, or we can see it from the North Korea leader, but you don't expect that from the leader of America.
Why do you hate us, Adesua? Why are you giving us as an example of bad things?
But honestly, it reminded me of the energy, the type of tweets, like the tonation, the language, the posturing. I'm like, this is what you see from a despot son. This is not what you see from quote unquote the leader of the free world, which is what America branded itself as for so long. And now that has completely fallen apart. So I mean, I'm definitely frightened at what is to come in terms of how America is going to support Israel. Because another thing is that Trump keeps using the word "we." In if you look at his messages that he's posting out, he says "we." He's using "we" to describe either himself and Netanyahu or America and Israel as if it is one entity that cannot be unbound. And so I think that for me is frightening for the people of Iran.
Charles, I want to come back to how Africa ought to respond to these kinds of international situations. Now, again, I'll take you back to 2003 when African leaders were lining up behind Bush and declaring how they were against terror, the war. They were for the war on terror. They didn't want to be part of the axis of evil. It was so important for every president on the African continent to be seen to be in line with the Bush doctrine, except one guy, by the way. And no money for guessing who it was. It was Isaias Afewaki. He just refused. He said this is not going to be part of that. The question I have for you, Charles, is in light of the realignments, the public positions that Trump is taking, how do Africans respond? How does the African establishment position and take or evolve itself into a relevant player? Because it is going to suffer the consequences of
Yeah.
whatever situation is happening between Iran and Israel. How can Africa respond? Do we leave South Africa to go it alone and be the moral voice, the moral compass, or does the AU step in? Or again, does Africa still have moral leaders of Mandela's stature who can, on their own, be a voice of reason?
No, but I think, in terms of collective action, we are going to see what happened when Russia attacked
Mm,
Ukraine. I think we're
mm,
going to see exactly the same posture because the majority of African countries ultimately were either
mm,
neutral or went with Russia. And
mm,
the same dynamics are playing out now. So I mean,
mm,
we can expect that there will be a repeat of that. But
mm,
and and one of the things that has made that even more inevitable, you must have seen earlier in the year what happened with the Israeli uh, ambassador in Addis Ababa. He
mm,
was denied audience when he
mm,
wanted to talk, to speak in the AU, one of the AU meetings. So I think that that is likely to be the drift because
mm.
one of the impacts of uh, Trump pooling his money is that for a lot of African countries, there is no currency, there is no payoff uh,
Mhm.
from uh, from backing a Western position. But
Mm.
there is, you can see in Kenya, for example, you see in commentary about because already the Americans have been shelling the Houthis who are
Yes.
Iran's allies. That
Yes.
has constricted traffic in the Red Sea. There is a lot of concern whether the Strait of Hormuz, which carries 20% of global oil, will shut. Because if that happens, the prediction, Robert, is that the price of fuel in Kenya, for example, will double.
Wow.
And that means that for Uganda, you'll be paying triple. So it's so because now what will happen is you are going to have ships will add anything between 10 to 14 days on their travel round. There are people who will
Wow.
benefit. The ports in the Mediterranean, some of the ports in West Africa, although the West African ports are not positioned to take
Mm.
advantage, but the biggest beneficiary will be Durban, because
Yes.
a lot of
So
traffic
we're already
either way
benefiting, right?
will pass through Durban, and I think that uh, Feral and her compatriots will be laughing all the way to the bank.
Charles, I was at a bank called Investec in Cape Town,
Yeah.
and it overlooks the harbor. And one of the bankers there was telling me that you can already see the increased traffic, and that the local maritime industry, which services ships and so
Yeah,
on, you could see an uptick in their numbers. This was last year.
yeah.
So I think that trend has only continued and is likely to accelerate. Doesn't help with your fuel prices though, but it was really interesting to me to see the almost immediate impacts for us.
Yeah, someone always win. But Bob, the
Yeah.
the the situation in parts of Africa will be different, and I think none of them typifies it like Uganda, because Uganda, so to speak, eats on both sides. It eats with Iran, it eats with Israel, and both of them in a very very big way. And it's not alone. There are other countries which are in that situation. So what do countries like that do?
Adesua, in our part of the world, we say you are eating from both sides of your mouth. You chew it this side, then you chew it.
But like,
That's
how does Uganda do this exactly? I'm not clear on this relationship.
so. Let me explain to you. Uganda is in the unique position as being the only African country where the Iranian head of state has every single Iranian head of state since Rafsanjani has visited Uganda. Every single president from the time of Rafsanjani has visited Uganda. And it was always a very fascinating um, situation for me until I found out why, or at least I asked a few people involved in our external intelligence why these guys were coming to Uganda. It couldn't just be about religion, because the only explanation was that you're trying to make a few Shia Muslims in Uganda. It's a very small sect happy. And then I discovered that Uganda was acting as a back route on discussions, a backdoor discussions on the nuclear program. So Uganda
Mm.
was availing itself as a diplomatic conduit between the Western powers and Iran on very frank discussions. In fact, there was even an exploration about how to link up with Israel. So Uganda was acting as an unsuspecting diplomatic conduit for Iran sending messages back and forth, which is something that our president has always done on behalf of what are called pariah leaders in the world. It starts with Gaddafi, some elements of North Korea, quietly playing that role, and it gives him a strategic fit. Now,
I find that so fascinating because I blame Uganda for Netanyahu. Did his brother die in Entebbe?
yes, but there is another angle. By the way, what you don't know, Adesu will tell you, it is Uganda that saved Obasanjo's neck from Abacha's rope. There's somebody here who flew in and spent 3.5 hours with Abacha begging not to get the guy executed after he finished Sarawiwa, and I think he was going to. But I'll come back. That is a story for another day. Now then we have this very close relationship with Israel from a security standpoint, but it goes a little further. Uganda was at some point negotiating between or mediating between Israel and Sudan to restore Sudan, the Sudan, the Khartoum side, to restore diplomatic relations, because it was one of the last Arab countries holding out. Certainly one of the last African ones holding out against reinstating diplomatic relations. But we had this weird situation where Netanyahu comes to visit Uganda on the anniversary of the Entebbe raid, and the man stands at Entebbe airport and gives a whole speech in Hebrew. He did not at any point speak in English or even acknowledge. He acknowledged politely that he was in Uganda. So the whole thing was for the effect of Israeli media rather than Uganda. But a lot of the security arrangements, the intelligence work that secures the current regime or the current president in power, especially from an information tech standpoint, comes from Israel. So we have this interesting alliance on a security point of view between Israel on one hand and Russia on another that secures the current government. So the question arises, if, say, the Arab world or the Muslim world firmly stand behind Iran against Israel, how does Uganda then push through with its recent initiative to get money and diplomatic cover from the Middle East and Arab countries? So, what if we go back to the 70s where you had to choose either you were pro Palestine or you were pro Israel? The middle is going to become terribly messy. And I think that we're going to end up with sores in our mouth and we will not be able to eat from any part of our mouth. But for me, I don't know, just the way to quickly wind up on this issue of Israel and Iran. Each one of you, very quickly, and starting with you, Adesua, how do you see this playing out generally? How does this end?
I'm trying to not be the pessimist on the on the screen
No, you have
again.
permission to.
But I think one thing that I have found profound has been to see the reaction of young people from all over the world on social media
Mm,
to what is being clearly seen as an Israeli aggression.
mm,
And it's such a shift from what we saw when it was America and Iraq,
mm,
where the voices of both the people and the world against his actions were in the minority,
mm,
right? We are seeing a very huge shift in the world, in geopolitics, but also in soft power.
mm,
America has lost its standing in a significant way, even with its own people.
mm,
And Israel has lost its moral high ground with every generation now alive that can read and write, I believe.
mm,
Where this is going to lead is, if Iran had nuclear weapons, they would not have bombed a nuclear facility, right? And
mm,
America's own intelligence has come out to say they did not believe that they were going to have nuclear weapons anytime soon.
mm,
If this ends up with regime change in Iran, it is going to completely reorient how all the Arab nations treat Israel moving forward, because they are now the big bad wolf of the Middle East, but also of the world. If America has decided to take the gloves off and stop pretending to be the leader of the free world and instead believe that might is right, it is going to completely change how other countries around the world interact with America. And that is going to mean that our world order will completely shift after this. Where it will end for the people of Iran is yet to be seen. But I think that this is the beginning of the end, in one way, of the American empire.
and certain political careers, you could say. The one of, definitely, I see the one of Netanyahu on the line. I don't see how he survives this one way or the other because of the
He keeps surviving things by starting new wars. It's a very
no.
good distraction tactic. I'll give him that.
Firio, how do you see this ending for Israel?
I'd like to chat about how we use words. I think
Yes.
the idea of America and Israel deciding who are pariah states has really been upended, as Adesua says. And
Mhm,
that's because we live in a social media age. That's because of a new generation who feels very differently. And it's certainly not language that I will adopt like we did perhaps before. So the
mhm,
moral authority of America for me is gone with the second Trump administration. And what
mhm,
I'm watching with great interest is whether those middle powers we've spoken about, several African countries, part of those, whether they will assert themselves sufficiently to see a de escalation of what could rapidly become a regional and a world war if those two nations are allowed to own the day. I was most interested in how President Macron of France said that Donald Trump was leaving to enter peace talks, and his immediate response on Truth Social is, what does he know that I'm going to go and do? So I do think you're going to see these middle powers begin to realize that they have to cohere more quickly, and that what it means for our G20 in November is becoming more and more interesting for me. It's either going to be a damp squib rained upon by the US and by Israel if the US decides not to come. On the other hand, it could be a coming together and cohering of these new forces which have to lead our world.
Charles, hearing from Furio talking about Macron's blunders makes me believe that there's only one guy in that whole room who has understood Trump very well, and I think it's Mike Carney of Canada. I think he's the one. He's the one who has played Trump so thoroughly that Trump just always has trouble dealing with him. But how do you see those powers dealing with this situation?
Y- just beyond the war itself, I think that there are bigger things, and I'll speak to one. They and they're so attached on it. If if you look at Israel and what the US are doing as part of a broader expression of Western culture, there are two
Mm,
things which in history, Western civilizations have done. They try to resolve their crises through colonialism
mm.
and war, and
Externalizing the crisis.
yeah, and there is nothing more dangerous than a power which is in decline, like the US,
Mm,
because it's almost inevitable. I mean, in history, every power in decline has resorted to political misadventure. I mean, military misadventure, and
mm.
because the US finds
The,
itself at a
the,
time,
the, the
you
Soviet
know,
the Soviet Union
eh,
went to
yeah,
Afghanistan in
yes,
79. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So the precisely because the US is in decline, war becomes necessary. Uh, You know, uh, the US actually recovered from the great, World War II is what ended the American Depression.
Hmm.
So you recruit a lot of young men, they go and die off in war, and then you pump a lot of money in the industry, you industrialize, and that is how the economy. There is a sense in which there is, you know, something bigger than just Iran itself. That this is um, the Western world order probably needs this.
Uh, Charles, related to that is interestingly that China, which has always been very cautious and very tentative in international affairs, especially in its choice of language and what positions to take, has stepped forward in two interesting ways. One is the foreign minister spoke out openly about attacking Iran or against the attack on Iran and urgently called for a ceasefire and to stop the escalation of the war. And it was a Chinese foreign minister. Usually, China is either quiet or calls upon all parties to be restrained. That's as far as they go. But clearly, for me, China is now stepping forward in assuming world leadership. And in another way, one of the latest positions it's taken is it has announced zero tariffs on all the African countries that have diplomatic relations with it in terms of trade. What do you think is the meaning of that? What is China in terms of leadership communicating to the rest of the world?
Uh, they you know the Chinese are fairly smart, and I think they sense an opportunity that in this in their broader competition with the US. The US has scored a lot of own goals, and because not only has the US done all these tariffs, it's it's also done this crazy visa thing. Probably in another 3 months, there'll be probably only six or so African countries which will not be under some kind of visa restriction,
Restriction.
and they are relishing it, and it's it's really a very smart move, for them to offer that. There is even talk that not only are they offering tariff-free access for African goods, but they will even subsidize the cost of some of the, so if Robert wants to export his coffee and you
Mhm.
can't afford to put it on a flight or a ship, then they'll give you a small grant to fund the export of that. And if that happens, they'll really run away with this game.
Exactly, and they'll fill up the gap on soft power by doing sensible things like that while the hostility comes from the US. And Furia, back to you. South Africa again provides an interesting template for us. First of all, it has a very close relationship with China in the BRICS arrangement.
Mm.
But one of the interesting illustrations of the growing Chinese or Southeast Asian power and its relationship with South Africa is what has happened to the car manufacturing processes in the Eastern Cape, particularly Port Elizabeth, where you see Chinese manufacturers setting up and replacing a
Mm.
lot of the Western. So how does your experiences with China, what do they lead to, and how does that lead as China replacing the US as a major player in terms of trade?
You know, if you drive on our streets, I think I told you this before, but the number of, we're learning new cars here, hey, I am at least. So cherries or Modas, Jaidus, it's big, 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 and it's rapidly displacing the old German giants, which our elites had always favored. So just from that, you can see already China is really entering this market as aggressively as it is globally. Very interesting to see that quick shift. But I do want to caution again. I mean, I really think what China's done this week has been tactically smart, politically smart. If you look at how they're using their social media channels, really asserting itself as a global leader in favor of peace and de escalation of this war. But actually, at the end of the day, that the tariff-free access is small and it needs a lot of work. Very few manufactured exports allowed into the Chinese market, and I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. So, I think for our countries on the continent, it is about getting more Chinese people to visit here because that can be the quickest, largest export earner, and that means making our countries giving it most favored nation status, and that allows those huge Chinese travel groups to start coming here. For me, that's the indicator I'm watching to see if this matters. I have to tell you a small story about visas. So China has increased free visa access to many nations, not South Africa. I'm traveling there. I want to travel there later in July. And my God, that Chinese visa is almost as difficult as the Iranian one I tried to get.
Are they X-raying your feet now?
They're not X-raying my feet, but not quite. But whoa, it's almost as difficult as a Schengen visa, hey?
Let me turn to you, Andesua, and I want to raise you to speak to two issues. One is how does this improve the infrastructure question? I think it's Nigeria that worked with China to build a metro line. I don't know how that has gone. Uh, it's also, I think, one of the few countries where a sitting Chinese president has visited fairly frequently. Believe it or not, we've never had a visit from a Chinese president in Uganda. Never. He's been to Rwanda, he's never been here. But also, you as Nigeria have been on the receiving end of visa restrictions for so long, especially from America. So just talk to me about the meaning of the new restrictions, both from the US, but also what China opens up in terms of infrastructure. Don't talk about the 30 kilometers of Tinubu, please. Just let's leave that out today.
30 lovely kilometers. You missed the bus terminal that they had a huge ceremony for yesterday. Um, you know, everyone was like, the president needs to go to Benue State. 200 people are dead. And he's like, I'll put it in my schedule for Wednesday. Okay? Because Tuesday, bus terminal. Um, so this is what we're seeing. Infrastructure. What does this mean? The ban, the visa ban. Like, Nigeria has not been put on the visa ban yet, but it's something they're mulling over in America, and the reasons for that are very well. It's they said corruption, but they also said the lack of record keeping, and we've had a couple of prison breaks or people go missing and things like that. These are the reasons why countries would put a visa ban in terms of having like a proper digital footprint to be able to even track your citizens even within your country. We lack that infrastructure. We lack that infrastructure significantly. How do I feel about it? I'm very happy for any Nigerian Trump supporters to be banned from America. It gives me joy to no end. I am that petty. Yes, I am that petty. I'm so happy for you people. Let them. They say it's a Muslim ban. I say, oh, you don't know your president is Muslim. Your vice president is Muslim. Trump 2.0, he will ban you again, and I'll be very happy. But I think what China is doing, honestly, going off of what Ferrell said, their strategy, their multi-pronged strategy is very intelligent because not only are we seeing this soft power build, but we're also seeing China take a lot of American and Western influencers to China, right? And using them as tools. And it's I honestly it's been so impressive. A lot of these are, I'm not Gen Z, even though I'm the young person on this on this panel right here, but I've been looking at the Gen Z guys who, these streamers who have millions and millions of supporters, and looking at what they are doing when they go to China and what they're showing of life in China, Chinese technology, how cool it is. And then you're seeing some lifestyle influencers also go to China and show you these spas on TikTok, on their
Spars.
streaming site. Also spas, it's like 24-hour spa in China, and you see, you're like, wow, like this is incredible. Um, but what China is doing is now positioning itself as a destination for tourism, for young people, and for governments. And this infrastructure thing is a very key conversation we always have, is that what do we benefit when we partner with different countries? The metro is one thing, and it's something that I actually pushed the governor on when I interviewed him, because we're not the first African country. I believe there's a, was it Kenya? Was it
Yeah.
Ethiopia that partnered with China for a metro
Yeah.
line?
Ethiopia,
And then
Ethiopia, and then Kenya.
Ethiopia, yes. And then they had problems afterwards because the Chinese didn't train the Ethiopians. They didn't have the spare parts or the expertise to essentially be able to run their metro line without constant support from China. And so the metro line was basically not very useful. And so when I met with the governor and we're building the blue rail line here in Lagos and the red and the yellow. And I was like, how do we ensure that we can maintain this by ourselves? That we have Nigerian expertise, that Nigerians understand the moving parts of this train that you're building, because it's not just like a gift, right? And we've had that before with the steel plant in Kogi State, where the Russians help us build a steel plant, and then it can't work without Russians, and so it's just never worked. It's just sat there for decades, and they don't know what to do with it. So these are the type of things that I think Chinese partnership can be beneficial, but we also have to have thinking leaders, right? People who understand the gravity of what it is to work with people on infrastructural projects. What on the type of quality projects you're getting, because we no longer look at China as, oh, you're going to get cheap quality, right? That has changed.
Mm.
But but this exchange must also be long term beneficial to us. It can't just be they're bringing a train and we don't have any driver.
You told the story of expertise support from the countries, which reminded me many years ago, the place where I worked, the printing press had been donated by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to, to Uganda. This was the situation. There were two Russian technicians who used to run that printing press. That's not the point. Those guys had full diplomatic status in Uganda. Full. They drove a CD vehicle. Yes, they had full. Anyway, so here's the point that I wanted to say about China, and which is a point that's being repeatedly made in response to Trump. That you see, China, there's no country in the world that has mastered, or no political establishment in the world that has mastered the art of long-term strategic planning and long-term strategic vision. I mean, the Communist Party of China is the master at those things, and they've been preparing for Trump 2.0 since 2018. So they were ready even before he came back. So they were playing with the script that Trump was coming back and he was going to
True.
do exactly what he did, including, by the way, the fact that Xi Jinping hasn't called him up to now. He's been sitting waiting for the call from Xi Jinping, and the guy has refused to call him. So all of this is part, the Chinese are scripting this thing. But so, which now neatly takes me to the one point that I want to throw at you, Charles. The UN is likely to go bankrupt in September unless something happens. Do you see the UN headquarters shifting to Beijing? And what happens? Or
Yeah,
Shanghai?
because one of the puzzling things is that part of the UN's crisis comes from the fact that China is a laggard in its payments to the. I know,
To,
I mean, the US is behind in, but for some reason, China with a lot of these international organizations, the
mm,
Chinese are not very hot about putting, their money in it. But the problem is serious.
mm,
Um, already, they have slashed more than 6,000 jobs.
yeah.
Um, they are projections that whole agencies, including UNAIDS,
Wow.
um, will be closed. And you know the difference between USAID cuts and UN cuts is this, because USAID basically gave out money, but there were very few Americans on the ground who were running around and executing those programs. The thing
Mm,
with the UN is that the UN had people on the ground, and
mm,
in a lot of there are many parts of Africa
mm,
where the only thing that exists is not just the
mm,
UN as an institution, but UN
mm,
staff. They are the only ones
mm,
who can go in some areas to distribute medicine to remote areas. They are the only ones who can distribute food. So
mm,
the crisis of the UN means a withdrawal of not just resources but of people,
mm,
and they they staff this organization so much that they are, take Central African Republic for
mm,
one.
mm.
The bureaucracy and the state there in many ways is just the UN. So if
Yes.
the UN takes away both, it's not taking away, it just doesn't have it. Takes away those resources, but most particularly takes away, the the muscle power. Yeah, I mean, the bureaucrats and officials who run in these things. We are going to see very many parts of Africa just losing so many years. Vaccination programs will collapse. Emergency food programs will collapse. Already, you have seen that countries which host a lot of refugees, like Uganda with several millions, and Kenya, there is they are soon failing even to feed the refugees. So the crisis of the UN is going to be 5, 10 times more problematic than the USAID fund withdrawals.
Adesua, what does Africa look like without the UN?
There's the Reuters report about hunger, the 13 hunger hotspots in the world: Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, Haiti, and then Congo, Myanmar, and Nigeria also rounding the list of the 13 global hotspots for hunger. And that without immediate humanitarian intervention, we're going to see extreme we're going to see famine in those areas, right? These are the areas of concern. That is what Africa unfortunately looks like without the UN. A lot of people were like, this presents the UN, USAID withdrawing presents an opportunity for African leaders to sit up because they have to sit up. And I completely disagreed. And I still disagree because we're not seeing that energy, right? We've seen some things, some posturing of let's give a little bit more in our budget towards health services, but they are not filling the gap, right? They are not filling the gap. And I realized something recently in Nigeria. I've realized that it's because, and I think it's true for Nigeria, but I think it's true for a lot of African leaders. They don't see these people as their people. I was listening to a speech where Tinubu was saying, I send my condolences to the people of Benue and the governor of Benue. I sympathize with the people of Benue. I said, why are you sympathizing with them? They're your people.
He doesn't know that.
I was like, what's going on here? Right? It's like he sent sympathies to India. Now he's sending sympathy to Benue. I said, Oga, you are the chief security officer of Benue State. Like, are you aware? And I think we have these things happen in different ways in different African countries where your country is maybe your capital city and where you're from, and everybody else is just someone that's there at the
Someone
same time
else.
as someone else.
Furio,
I think that's what we're seeing.
South Africa has never been in a humanitarian situation in the real sense of the word. What are the lessons we can learn from you of how you rebuild away from humanitarianism? And is this the end of humanitarianism?
Very interesting question, Bob. I consider ourselves to be in a permanent humanitarian situation. In Tata last week, there was such the floods were so killer that it was as bad as Nigeria the other week for the numbers of people who died, the people who have been displaced. I suppose what we have going for us is a very strong internal humanitarian response system, mostly through Gift of the Givers, that organization that we've spoken about quite a lot before. And we have very good homegrown disaster response, and also the fact that we're middle income, and so that there is money. It's slow to come, but to replace the PEPFAR program, for example, we don't have a lot of UN programs in South Africa, other than some small support for refugees and asylum seekers. So I suppose it's because we haven't ever needed it. It does exist domestically, and perhaps that's the lesson: is to build, as African economies grow, to build your domestic capabilities for humanitarianism. But I do want to give my parting shot, if I may,
Yes, I was
because I have to
gonna.
get going.
Yes,
Thank
go ahead.
you. So I've really learned from Adesiwa, and my reporter's notebook shows that of late I've been invited to the opening of traffic lights, drains, and street lights being switched on. And so I know now that's a load of rubbish, and I should just treat it as such.
Okay, and I'll go next, then Adesuo, then Charles. For me, I a lot of good things are happening, yes, but watching that footage of the Kenyan security man just shooting dead a guy who was selling masks. He just shot him point blank, and the guy died, and he walked away casually. I mean, I don't know at what point, and I'm finding myself painfully agreeing with Adesua. I don't know at what point these African leaders are going to realize that they're brewing a disaster. You can't treat African lives as if they're just dispensable pieces of paper. The price is going to be extremely high. The reaction of these kids when they eventually get, they're going to be, the revenge is going to be painful to watch for a lot of people that we respected. Adesua.
Well, I've decided, as you were speaking there, that I will not give Tinubu my parting shot. I'm sick and tired of the man. I'm not gonna lie to you. But but my parting shot is actually for the TV anchor, the news anchor, Sahari Mami, the journalist that was on Iranian state TV as Israel bombed the building, who came back 20 minutes later to continue her job. Especially when we consider how many journalists have been killed in Gaza by Israel, by the IDF, journalists killed in Beirut by Israel. Seeing them do that on during a live broadcast, obviously that is a signal not just to journalists who are trying to cover these stories, but also to the people watching, right? That is a kind of psychological attack on the people of Iran by bombing the journalists on live TV. So my parting shot is to her, because kudos to her for coming back 20 minutes later and finishing her live broadcast. Wherever you stand on this, if you're supporting Israel or you're supporting Iran, attacking journalists is a war crime. We all know that. And for it to be so blatantly so done, so right in front of our faces is one thing, but kudos to Miss Imami for coming back out here and continuing her job.
Charles, wind it up.
Well, I know you fellows are pagans. You are not like us. You are never altar boys. So I don't, I don't know.
Adesua
but
used to
uh,
say that grace at
but
the
uh, but
table,
uh,
so
but
at least
but
she's
we
close.
Catholics have something we call beatification. But you know what that is, okay?
Yes.
But on Sunday, the Vatican beatified a 26-year-old Congolese customs worker,
Wow.
and he is called Floribo Bwana Chui Bin Kositi. He's got a very long name,
Mhm.
but then I was reading the story. This Kositi was killed in 2007.
Wow.
Why? He was a customs officer, and he refused a bribe to let in contaminated rice into the country, which was going to
Yes.
be distributed to poor people.
Yes. Yes.
So they actually picked him in the evening and murdered him. So it's he is really a true hero, and the I don't think I've ever counted a story like this where someone who is trying to do good. I mean, I know people who've tried to stop corruption have been kicked out and all this, but for you to be abducted and murdered because you refuse to take a bribe to let contaminated rice, come in and feed your people, it's something else. So I think he fully deserves it.
It deserves to be a saint.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you, guys. Please remember,
Thank you.
subscribe, like, follow, and recommend us to all your haters. That's the only way. And your exes. That's the best way to send pain. Bye, guys.